The invitation to her granddaughter's wedding arrived in the mail, but Dorothy's hands trembled as she read the words, "Please don't attend. Your clothes might ruin the event." At 74 years old, Dorothy had never cared much for fancy things. She had lived a modest life, one filled with sacrifices and silent love for her family. But this invitation, the way it so casually discarded her, broke something deep inside her. The granddaughter she had raised, the girl she had loved beyond measure, didn't want her there, not because of who she was, but because of the way she appeared. The shame was unbearable. But what Sophia didn't know was that behind those simple clothes, there was a woman who had given everything for the family, who had made unimaginable sacrifices to ensure that everyone else had what they needed. Dorothy's life wasn't just about the quiet, humble existence she led. It was about the secrets buried deep within her past, the kind that could change everything. Do you want to know why Dorothy was truly excluded? Stay with us until the end and uncover the truth behind a love that was too big to be understood. If you're ready to learn about the sacrifices that define us, the stories we hide, and the emotions that bind families together, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. This is just the beginning of an unforgettable journey. The wedding invitation to Sophia's ceremony arrived like a promise of joy, but Dorothy knew something was wrong before she even opened the envelope. The paper felt too thick, too expensive, nothing like the simple cards she was used to receiving from her granddaughter. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of washing dishes at the local diner and tending to her small garden behind the trailer park, trembled slightly as she tore open the elegant seal. Dorothy Martinez had spent 73 years in Bakersfield, California, watching the oil rigs pump endlessly under the scorching sun, while she scraped together enough to survive on her Social Security checks and the tips from her weekend shifts at Mel's Diner on Chester Avenue. The double-wide trailer she called home sat in Shady Acres Mobile Home Park, where the American flag she'd hung outside had faded to pale pink stripes after years of desert wind and relentless sunshine. Inside the invitation, written in gold cursive letters that seemed to mock her simple life, was the announcement that would shatter her heart. Sophia Christine Valdez and Jonathan Michael Whitman request your presence at their wedding celebration at the Ritz-Carlton in Los Angeles, Saturday, October 14th, 2023. But it was the handwritten note attached in her granddaughter's familiar handwriting that made Dorothy sink into her worn recliner, the same chair where she'd rocked Sophia to sleep during countless visits when the little girl was young. The note read, "Dear Abuela, I know this might sound harsh, but I need you to understand. This wedding is very important to Jonathan's family and their business associates. Your usual outfits, they might not fit the occasion. Maybe it's better if you just send your blessing instead of coming. I hope you understand. Love, Sophia." The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. She read them 3 times, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. Your usual outfits. She looked down at her faded floral dress from Walmart, purchased 2 years ago on clearance for $12. It was clean, pressed, and had carried her through church services, family gatherings, and every important moment she could afford to attend. But now, according to her own flesh and blood, it wasn't good enough. Dorothy's mind flashed back to the little girl who used to spend entire summers in this very trailer. The same child who would beg to help in the garden, who would sit on the kitchen counter eating her abuela's homemade tortillas while listening to stories about their family's journey from Mexico to California. That little girl had never cared about Dorothy's clothes then. She had only cared about the love that filled every corner of their modest home. The afternoon sun streamed through the thin curtains, illuminating the family photos scattered across the coffee table. Pictures of Sophia's quinceañera, her high school graduation, her college acceptance letter. In every single photo, Dorothy stood proudly beside her granddaughter, wearing the same simple dresses, the same genuine smile. But somewhere along the way, as Sophia climbed the social ladder with her education and her engagement to Jonathan Whitman, whose father owned half the real estate in Beverly Hills, those simple dresses had become a source of shame. Dorothy rose from her chair and walked to the small closet in her bedroom. Hanging there were 7 dresses, 3 pairs of slacks, and 1 blazer she'd bought for special occasions. Each piece told a story. The navy dress she'd worn to her husband Roberto's funeral 15 years ago, the black slacks she'd put on for Sophia's college graduation, the cream-colored blouse she'd saved for months to buy when Sophia announced her engagement. She pulled out the navy dress, the nicest thing she owned, and held it against her body, looking at herself in the cracked mirror mounted on the closet door. The fabric was starting to pill slightly, and the hem had been mended twice, but it was dignified, respectable. It was the dress of a woman who had worked 3 jobs to help put her granddaughter through UC Berkeley, who had sent $20 bills in birthday cards even when she could barely afford groceries. As she stood there, memories flooded back like a dam bursting. She remembered the night Sophia had called, crying because she couldn't afford her textbooks junior year. Dorothy had driven to 3 different pawn shops to sell Roberto's watch, the one thing of value she'd kept after his death, to send Sophia $500. She remembered working double shifts during the holidays so she could buy Sophia the laptop she needed for her senior thesis. She remembered the pride in Sophia's voice when she'd called to say she'd gotten the job at the marketing firm in Los Angeles, how she'd thanked Dorothy for all her sacrifices. But now, those sacrifices seemed to mean nothing compared to the embarrassment her appearance might cause at a fancy wedding. Dorothy sat on the edge of her bed, still clutching the navy dress, and let the tears come. They fell silently at first, then in great, heaving sobs that shook her small frame. She cried for the little girl who used to call her the best abuela in the whole world. She cried for the woman she'd become, invisible, unwanted, a reminder of humble beginnings that her granddaughter now wanted to erase. The trailer felt smaller than ever as darkness began to fall outside. Dorothy could hear her neighbors' televisions through the thin walls, the sound of families settling in for another evening. Mrs. Patterson next door was watching her nightly game shows, and the Rodriguez family on the other side was having dinner, their children's laughter drifting through the open windows. Dorothy looked at the wedding invitation again, studying the elegant script and the expensive cardstock. Everything about it screamed wealth and sophistication, things she had never been able to provide for her family, no matter how hard she worked. She thought about Jonathan Whitman's family, people she'd never met but who apparently set the standard for what was acceptable at their son's wedding. People who would judge Sophia not just on her accomplishments or character, but on whether her family looked the part of success. As the night deepened, Dorothy made a decision that felt like giving up a piece of her soul. She folded the invitation carefully and placed it in her jewelry box, next to Roberto's wedding ring and the rosary beads her mother had given her decades ago. Then she hung the navy dress back in the closet, knowing she wouldn't need it for October 14th. The silence in the trailer was deafening as Dorothy prepared for bed, her heart heavy with the knowledge that love, apparently, wasn't enough to earn her a seat at her own granddaughter's wedding. She turned off the lights and lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and wondering when she had become someone to be ashamed of, and how the little girl who once thought she hung the moon could now find her presence an embarrassment. Outside, the desert wind rattled the windows of Shady Acres Mobile Home Park, carrying with it the dreams and disappointments of all who lived there. People just like Dorothy who had worked their entire lives, only to discover that in America, love and sacrifice didn't always translate to worth in the eyes of those who mattered most. The morning after Dorothy made her painful decision, the California sun rose mercilessly over Bakersfield, casting long shadows across the mobile home park, like fingers pointing accusingly at her door. She had barely slept, tossing and turning on her thin mattress, while the weight of Sophia's rejection pressed down on her chest like a stone. Dorothy sat at her small kitchen table, the same formica surface where she had helped Sophia with countless homework assignments, and stared at her cup of instant coffee growing cold. The wedding invitation lay beside her breakfast of toast and jam. Simple food for a simple woman, as her granddaughter apparently saw her. At 9:30, her flip phone buzzed with a call from Linda, her daughter and Sophia's mother. Dorothy had been dreading this conversation, knowing that Linda would want to discuss the wedding plans, completely unaware of the devastating note that had accompanied the invitation. "Mom, how are you feeling about the wedding?" Linda's voice carried the rushed tone of someone multitasking. As a nurse at Kern Medical Center, Linda had learned to compress conversations into the brief moments between patients. "Have you thought about what you're going to wear? I was thinking we could go shopping together this weekend." Dorothy's throat constricted. For a moment, she considered telling Linda everything, about Sophia's cruel request, about the shame that now colored every piece of clothing in her closet, about the way her heart had shattered reading those words. But as she opened her mouth, she realized she couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her daughter's eyes, or worse, the possibility that Linda might agree with Sophia's assessment. "Actually, mija," Dorothy said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "I've been thinking, and I don't believe I should go to the wedding." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. "What do you mean you're not going?" "Mom, it's Sophia's wedding. Of course you're going." Dorothy closed her eyes and leaned back in her kitchen chair, the same chair where she'd fed Linda breakfast before school 40 years ago, where she'd comforted her daughter through her divorce from Sophia's father. "I just think maybe it's better this way. You know how these fancy events are. I wouldn't fit in with all those important people." "Mom, that's ridiculous." Linda's voice took on the tone she used with difficult patience. "Your family. You belong there more than anyone." But Dorothy could hear something else in her daughter's voice. A tiny hesitation, a pause that suggested maybe, just maybe, Linda had harbored similar thoughts about her mother's simple appearance at such an elegant affair. The realization cut deeper than Sophia's letter had. "Linda, you know I've never been comfortable in those situations," Dorothy said, manufacturing reasons that felt hollow even as she spoke them. "All those wealthy people, the fancy venue. I'd just be worried the whole time about saying the wrong thing or looking out of place." The truth was, Dorothy had attended every significant event in her family's life, from school plays to graduations, never once considering whether she belonged. She had stood proudly in the audience at Sophia's high school graduation, cheering louder than anyone when her granddaughter's name was called. She had worked extra shifts to afford the gas money to drive to Berkeley for Sophia's college graduation, wearing her best dress and beaming with pride. But now, for the first time in her life, she was being told she didn't belong. "You know what?" Linda said after another pause. "Maybe you could use the money you would have spent on a new outfit for something else. The wedding is going to be expensive for everyone, with hotels and everything." There it was, the confirmation Dorothy had been dreading. Even Linda, her own daughter, could see the logic in keeping the embarrassing grandmother away from the society wedding. After hanging up, Dorothy sat in her trailer feeling more alone than she had since Roberto's death. She looked around at the space that had been their home for 30 years, at the carefully maintained furniture and the spotless surfaces that proved cleanliness didn't require wealth. This trailer had been filled with laughter during Sophia's childhood visits, with the smell of homemade tamales during holidays, with the quiet contentment of a simple life lived with dignity. But dignity, apparently, wasn't enough for the Whitmans of Beverly Hills. Dorothy walked to her bedroom and opened the closet door once more. She pulled out the navy dress, her wedding dress, her funeral dress, her graduation dress, and held it against her body one final time. Then, with trembling hands, she folded it carefully and placed it in the back of the closet, behind the winter coats she rarely needed in the desert climate. As the day wore on, Dorothy went through the motions of her routine. watering her small garden, dusting the furniture, preparing a simple lunch, but everything felt different now. She was no longer a grandmother, preparing to celebrate her granddaughter's wedding. She was a woman who had been deemed unworthy of witnessing the most important day in her granddaughter's life. That evening, as the sun set behind the oil derricks and the trailer park settled into its familiar quiet, Dorothy sat in her recliner and made peace with her decision. She would not go to the wedding. She would spare Sophia the embarrassment of her presence, and she would spare herself the pain of standing among people who saw her as a liability rather than family. But as she prepared for bed, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that in choosing to stay away, she was losing something far more valuable than a seat at a fancy wedding. She was losing the last connection to the little girl who had once loved her unconditionally. 3 days after making her heartbreaking decision, Dorothy found herself unable to sleep again. The October heat still clung to Bakersfield like a suffocating blanket, and her small window air conditioning unit wheezed and rattled through the night. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and decided to tackle a project she'd been avoiding for months, cleaning out Roberto's old desk. The wooden desk, scarred from years of use, had been Roberto's workspace when he did odd carpentry jobs to supplement his income from the oil fields. Dorothy had barely touched it since his death, afraid that disturbing his things would somehow erase the last traces of his presence in their home. But tonight, with her heart already broken and her mind restless, it seemed like the right time to face those memories. She pulled out drawer after drawer of receipts, old bills, and Roberto's careful handwriting documenting every penny they'd ever spent or saved. Her husband had been meticulous with money, understanding that every dollar mattered when you lived paycheck to paycheck. In the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of warranty papers for appliances they'd long since replaced, Dorothy's fingers found an envelope she'd never seen before. The envelope was addressed to her in Linda's teenage handwriting, but the postmark was from 1987, 36 years ago. Dorothy's hands trembled as she opened it, wondering why Roberto had kept a letter from their daughter hidden in his desk all these years. The letter was written on notebook paper, the kind Linda used in high school, and dated 3 weeks before her 18th birthday. Dear Mom, I know I can never say this to your face because it would hurt too much, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I found out about Aunt Carmen's medical bills. I know you've been working those extra shifts at the diner and the laundromat, and I know you sold Grandma's wedding ring to help pay for her cancer treatments. I also know you turned down that job at the bank in Fresno, the one that would have doubled your salary, because you couldn't leave Carmen when she was so sick. I heard you crying last night after you got off the phone with the hospital. I was supposed to be asleep, but I listened at the door. You told them you'd find a way to pay, that family takes care of family. You didn't know that I'd already gotten my acceptance letter from UC Davis with a full scholarship. You didn't know because I hid it from you. Mom, I'm not going to college. I can't watch you destroy yourself trying to pay for Carmen's treatments and my education at the same time. I'm going to get a job and help with the bills. I know you'll fight me on this, so I'm not going to tell you until after Carmen gets better, but I need you to know that everything you've sacrificed, everything you've given up for our family, I see it all. And someday, when I have a daughter of my own, I hope I can love her half as much as you love me and Carmen. You are the strongest woman I know, and I'm proud to be your daughter, even if I don't always show it. Love, Linda. Dorothy's vision blurred as tears streamed down her cheeks. She remembered 1987 vividly, the year Carmen lost her battle with breast cancer despite Dorothy's desperate efforts to pay for experimental treatments. She remembered Linda's sudden decision to skip college and work at the local grocery store instead, a choice that had puzzled Dorothy at the time because Linda had always been such a brilliant student. What Dorothy hadn't known was that Linda had received a full scholarship to UC Davis, an opportunity that would have changed the trajectory of her entire life. Instead, Linda had quietly sacrificed her dreams to help support the family, just as Dorothy had sacrificed her own ambitions years earlier. The letter also revealed something else Dorothy had forgotten in her grief. She had indeed been offered a position at a bank in Fresno, a job that would have provided steady income and benefits. But she had turned it down without a second thought because Carmen needed daily care, and Dorothy couldn't bear the idea of leaving her sister alone during her final months. As Dorothy sat in the dark trailer, surrounded by the ghosts of old decisions and hidden sacrifices, she began to understand something profound about her family's pattern of love. Generation after generation, the women in her family had quietly given up pieces of themselves to protect and provide for others. She had done it for Carmen, Linda had done it for the family, and now Sophia was asking her to do it again, to give up her place at the wedding to protect Sophia's new social standing. But this time felt different. This time, the sacrifice wasn't born from love, but from shame. Dorothy carefully folded Linda's letter and placed it in her jewelry box, next to the wedding invitation she'd hidden there days earlier. Then she sat down at Roberto's desk and pulled out a piece of paper. Her handwriting, shaky with age and emotion, began forming words that had been building inside her for decades. My dear Sophia, there are things about our family you don't know, stories of love and sacrifice that I've kept quiet because I thought they didn't matter. But tonight I realize that maybe they're the only things that do matter. Day. As the desert wind howled outside and the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon, Dorothy wrote about Carmen's illness, about Linda's hidden scholarship, about the countless small sacrifices that had woven their family together across generations. She wrote about dignity, found not in designer clothes, but in the choices we make when no one is watching. When she finished, Dorothy sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote Sophia's name on the front. But as her finger hovered over the stamps in Roberto's desk drawer, she hesitated. Would sending this letter change anything, or would it only confirm to Sophia that her grandmother was indeed someone to be ashamed of, a woman who lived in the past, clinging to stories of sacrifice that meant nothing in the world of Beverly Hills society weddings? Dorothy placed the letter in the jewelry box alongside the wedding invitation, still unsure whether some truths were better left unspoken. 2 weeks after her wedding at the Ritz-Carlton, Sophia Whitman sat in her new Malibu home, staring at the Pacific Ocean through floor-to-ceiling windows that had cost more than her grandmother's trailer. The wedding had been everything she'd dreamed of, elegant, sophisticated, and perfectly curated for Jonathan's business associates and social media presence. Yet something felt hollow about the entire experience, a nagging emptiness that she couldn't shake. The absence had been more noticeable than she'd anticipated. During the father-daughter dance, she'd found herself looking toward the back of the ballroom, half expecting to see Dorothy's familiar face beaming with pride. When the photographer asked for family photos, the space where her grandmother should have stood felt like a gaping wound in the carefully arranged portrait of her new life. Jonathan had noticed her distraction during their honeymoon in Tuscany. "You seem distant," he'd said over dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Florence. "Is everything okay?" But how could she explain that amid all the luxury and perfection, she missed the woman whose presence would have somehow made it all feel more real? Now back in California, Sophia found herself drawn to her laptop, scrolling through the wedding photos posted on Instagram. In every image, she looked radiant and sophisticated, exactly the bride she'd wanted to be. But late at night, she would close the laptop and remember the summers she'd spent in Bakersfield, sleeping on the pull-out couch in Dorothy's trailer, helping tend the small garden where her grandmother grew the most beautiful tomatoes she'd ever tasted. The guilt had been building for days when Sophia decided to drive to Bakersfield unannounced. She told Jonathan she was visiting her mother Linda, but her real destination was Shady Acres Mobile Home Park. As her white BMW wound through the familiar streets of her grandmother's neighborhood, she felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and discomfort at how different everything looked from the perspective of her new life. She parked outside Dorothy's trailer and noticed immediately how quiet it seemed. Usually, her grandmother would have music playing on her old radio, or the sound of the television would drift through the thin walls. But today, there was only silence. Sophia knocked on the door, her manicured fingernails tapping against the metal frame. "Abuela, it's me, Sophia." No response. She tried the handle and found it unlocked. Dorothy had never been one to worry about security in the close-knit trailer park community. "Abuela?" she called again as she stepped inside. The trailer was immaculate as always, but something felt different. The usual warmth and life seemed drained from the space. Sophia noticed that Dorothy's favorite recliner was perfectly positioned, as if she'd been sitting there recently, but a thin layer of dust had settled on the side table where her grandmother always kept her reading glasses and crossword puzzle books. On the kitchen counter, Sophia found a note written in Dorothy's careful handwriting. "Gone to visit my sister Rosa in Phoenix for a few weeks. If anyone needs me, I'm taking some time to think. Dorothy." But the note was dated 5 days ago, and Sophia knew that Rosa had died 3 years earlier. She had attended the funeral with Dorothy, holding her grandmother's hand as they lowered the casket into the desert ground. A chill ran down Sophia's spine as she realized her grandmother had lied about where she was going. In the small bedroom, she found the closet doors open and several pieces of clothing missing, along with Dorothy's old leather suitcase that had traveled with her from Mexico decades ago. Sophia sank onto her grandmother's bed, the same bed where Dorothy had told her bedtime stories about their family's journey to America, about her grandfather Roberto's dreams of building a better life for his children. The wedding invitation was nowhere to be found, but Sophia spotted something else on the nightstand, a small jewelry box that had belonged to Dorothy's mother. Inside the jewelry box, beneath Roberto's wedding ring and her great-grandmother's rosary, Sophia found 2 items that made her heart stop: the wedding invitation she had sent and a sealed envelope addressed to her in Dorothy's handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and began to read. "My dear Sophia, there are things about our family you don't know, stories of love and sacrifice that I've kept quiet because I thought they didn't matter. But tonight, I realize that maybe they're the only things that do matter. Your mother Linda once gave up a full scholarship to UC Davis to help me pay for your great-aunt Carmen's cancer treatments. She never told me about the scholarship until years later, but she sacrificed her dreams because she understood that family means putting love before personal advancement. I have worked 3 jobs at times to help pay for your education, sold my most precious possessions to make sure you had what you needed. I have never asked for anything in return except the joy of watching you succeed. But I realize now that my love has become a burden to you, and my simple life an embarrassment that threatens your new position in society. I want you to know that I understand your choice. I have decided not to attend your wedding, not because I don't love you, but because I love you too much to cause you shame on the most important day of your life. I will always be proud of the woman you've become, even if that woman no longer has room in her life for the grandmother who raised her." The letter continued for several more paragraphs, detailing sacrifices Sophia had never known about, explaining the depth of Dorothy's love and the pain of her rejection. As she read, Sophia felt her carefully constructed new identity begin to crumble around her. She had spent so much energy trying to erase her humble beginnings that she had erased the person who had made her success possible in the first place. And now, Dorothy was gone, disappeared into the vastness of America like so many people who become inconvenient to those they've helped lift up. Sophia clutched the letter to her chest and wept, finally understanding that in trying to protect her new life, she had destroyed something infinitely more valuable than social status. She had broken the heart of the woman who had loved her unconditionally since birth. Sophia spent the next 3 days calling every hospital, police station, and bus depot between Bakersfield and Phoenix, desperately searching for any trace of Dorothy Martinez. Each dead end deepened her panic and guilt. Her grandmother had simply vanished, leaving behind only the devastating letter that Sophia now carried everywhere, reading and rereading the words that shattered her understanding of her own family's history. On the fourth day, driven by desperation, Sophia decided to confront her mother. She drove to Linda's small apartment in Delano, where her mother had lived since her divorce 15 years earlier. The contrast between Linda's modest two-bedroom unit and Sophia's Malibu mansion had never felt more stark or more shameful. Linda was preparing for her night shift at the hospital when Sophia arrived, her scrubs laid out on the bed and her badge clipped to a lanyard that had seen better years. The surprise on her mother's face when she opened the door quickly shifted to concern when she saw Sophia's red-rimmed eyes and disheveled appearance. "Mia, what's wrong? You look terrible," Linda said, ushering her daughter inside. The apartment smelled like her mother's signature candles from the dollar store, mixed with the lingering aroma of reheated Chinese takeout. "Mom, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Sophia's voice trembled as she pulled Dorothy's letter from her purse. "Did you really give up a full scholarship to UC Davis to help with Aunt Carmen's medical bills?" Linda's face went pale. She sank into her worn fabric sofa, the same one she'd had since Sophia was in middle school, and covered her face with her hands. The silence stretched between them like a chasm filled with 36 years of unspoken sacrifices. "How did you find out?" Linda finally whispered. "Abuela wrote me a letter. She's gone, Mom. She disappeared, and I think it's because of what I did." Sophia's voice broke as she explained about the wedding invitation, about the cruel note she'd included, about Dorothy's empty trailer, and the lie about visiting Rosa. Linda looked up at her daughter with an expression of horror and disappointment that cut deeper than any punishment from childhood. "You told your grandmother she couldn't come to your wedding because of her clothes. Sophia, how could you?" "I was scared," Sophia sobbed. "Jonathan's family, their friends, they're all so wealthy and sophisticated. I was afraid they'd judge me, judge us. I thought if she stayed away, no one would know where I came from. And where you came from is so terrible." Linda's voice rose with an anger Sophia had rarely heard from her soft-spoken mother. "That woman worked herself to the bone for you. She sold her mother's jewelry to buy you a laptop for college. She worked double shifts at that diner until her feet bled, because she was too proud to ask for help, but never too proud to give everything she had for her family." Linda stood up and walked to a small desk in the corner of the living room. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a manila folder thick with papers. "You want to know about sacrifices? You want to know what your grandmother never told you?" She spread the documents across the coffee table. Medical bills from Carmen's cancer treatment, loan applications that had been denied, payment plans for chemotherapy that stretched over years. But it was the acceptance letter from UC Davis that made Sophia's breath catch in her throat. "Full ride scholarship," Linda said, pointing to the letter dated 1987. "Tuition, room, board, everything. I was going to study pre-med, become a doctor, but your grandmother was killing herself, trying to pay for Carmen's treatments while supporting me, so I quietly declined the scholarship, got a job at Rayleigh's supermarket, and told everyone I'd changed my mind about college." Sophia stared at the letter, realizing that her mother's entire life had been shaped by a sacrifice she'd never known about. Linda had eventually become a nurse through community college and night school, but the path had taken her nearly a decade longer and cost her countless opportunities. "There's more," Linda continued, her voice heavy with memories. "In 2008, when the economy crashed and you were starting your senior year at Berkeley, your grandmother mortgaged the trailer, the only thing she owned, to make sure you could finish school without taking on more student loans. She was 72 years old and took on a 30-year mortgage because she believed in your dreams more than her own security." The revelation hit Sophia like a physical blow. She remembered that year vividly. The stress about money, the fear that she might have to drop out before graduation. But somehow, the financial pressure had mysteriously eased, and Dorothy had simply said she'd worked some things out when Sophia asked about it. Linda pulled out one final document, a handwritten will that Dorothy had left with her years earlier. She left everything to you, Sophia. The trailer, her life insurance, even her social security benefits were set up to transfer to you after her death. But more than that, she left you a legacy of unconditional love that you threw away because you were embarrassed by the wrapper it came in. As the weight of her grandmother's sacrifices settled over her, Sophia understood that she had committed an unforgivable betrayal. She had taken the love of the most selfless person in her life and rejected it because it didn't fit the image she wanted to project to people who would never love her a fraction as much as Dorothy did. "I have to find her, Mom," Sophia whispered. "I have to make this right." Linda looked at her daughter with a mixture of pity and hope. "I don't know if you can, Mija. Some wounds are too deep to heal. But if you're going to try, you better be prepared to give up everything that's been more important to you than family. Because that's what real love requires, the willingness to sacrifice for others the way they sacrificed for you." For 2 weeks, Sophia hired a private investigator, called every shelter and senior center in a 3-state radius, and even posted Dorothy's photo on social media missing person groups. The search consumed her days and haunted her nights, while Jonathan grew increasingly frustrated with his new wife's obsession with finding an old woman who obviously doesn't want to be found. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, Dorothy's neighbor at the trailer park, called Linda with information she'd been reluctant to share. She had seen Dorothy leave in a taxi 3 weeks earlier, carrying her old leather suitcase and a small bag of groceries. But more importantly, she had overheard Dorothy on the phone the night before, talking to someone about the old Greyhound station in Fresno and taking the bus like we used to. Linda immediately called Sophia. "She's not in Phoenix, Mija. I think she went to Fresno, to the neighborhood where we lived when you were little, before Dad left us." "Adi?" Sophia's heart raced as she remembered the small apartment on Tulare Street where they had lived when she was in elementary school, before Dorothy had insisted they move in with her after Linda's divorce. It was a rundown area that had been gentrifying slowly over the years, but Dorothy had always spoken fondly of their time there, of how they had been a real family for those few years before everything fell apart. The drive from Malibu to Fresno took Sophia through the Central Valley, past fields of almonds and grapes that stretched endlessly under the October sun. With each mile, she felt herself traveling not just through space, but through time, back to a version of herself that had been simpler, more authentic, less concerned with appearances than with belonging. She found Dorothy at a small church on the south side of Fresno, sitting in the back pew during afternoon mass. Even from behind, Sophia recognized the set of her grandmother's shoulders, the way she held her rosary beads, the familiar navy dress that Sophia now knew represented not poverty, but dignity maintained, despite countless hardships. Sophia waited until the service ended, watching as Dorothy lit a candle at the small shrine to the Virgin of Guadalupe near the altar. When the church had mostly emptied, Sophia approached slowly, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum floor, in a sound that seemed to echo through decades of guilt and regret. "Abuela," she whispered. Dorothy turned, and Sophia saw that her grandmother had aged years in the few weeks since the wedding. Her face was thinner, her eyes shadowed with a sadness that seemed to have settled permanently into the lines around them. But when she saw Sophia, those eyes filled with a complex mixture of love, pain, and something that might have been relief. "Sophia," Dorothy said softly, "how did you find me?" "Mrs. Patterson, the whole family has been looking for you. Mom is worried sick." Sophia slid into the pew beside her grandmother, noticing how Dorothy instinctively shifted away, creating distance where once there had been only closeness. "I needed time to think," Dorothy said, her voice barely audible above the sound of traffic outside. "Time to understand how I failed you so completely that you became ashamed of me." The words hit Sophia like a slap. "You didn't fail me, Abuela. I failed you. I read your letter. Mum told me about the scholarship, about the mortgage on your trailer, about everything you sacrificed for our family. I've been the most selfish, ungrateful person in the world." Dorothy's hands tightened around her rosary beads. "No, mija, I see it now. I held on to you too tight, kept you connected to a world you needed to leave behind. You married into a good family, wealthy people who can give you things I never could. It's natural that you would want to protect that." "That's not who I want to be." Sophia's voice echoed in the empty church, causing a few remaining parishioners to turn and look. She lowered her voice, but couldn't reduce the intensity of her emotion. "I spent so much time trying to fit into Jonathan's world that I forgot who I really am. I forgot that the most important person in my life was a woman who cleaned other people's houses so I could go to college, who worked until her hands were raw, so I could have opportunities she never had." Dorothy finally turned to face her granddaughter fully, and Sophia saw tears streaming down the weathered cheeks. "But that world you married into, it's real, Sophia. Those people, their opinions, they matter for your future. I understand why you couldn't have me there." "No, you don't understand," Sophia said, reaching for Dorothy's hands despite her grandmother's attempt to pull away. "I was a coward. I was so afraid of being judged that I judged you first. I looked at the woman who raised me, who loved me more than anyone ever will, and I saw embarrassment instead of strength. I saw shame instead of dignity. I saw poverty instead of the richest heart I've ever known." The silence between them stretched as Dorothy absorbed her granddaughter's words. Around them, the church felt heavy with the weight of unspoken prayers and decades of confessions, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see whether love could triumph over pride and fear. "The wedding is over, Abuela," Sophia whispered. "But our relationship doesn't have to be. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to be the granddaughter you deserved all along. The one who's proud of where she came from, who understands that having you in my life isn't something to hide. It's the greatest blessing I've ever received." Dorothy studied her granddaughter's face, searching for sincerity in eyes that looked so much like her own. "And your husband, his family? What happens when they meet the embarrassing grandmother from the trailer park?" Sophia's answer came without hesitation. "Then they'll meet the woman who made me who I am. And if they can't accept that, then they don't deserve to be part of our family." The drive back from Fresno to Bakersfield felt different than any journey Sophia and Dorothy had taken together. They rode mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, filled with the tentative hope of healing rather than the suffocating weight of unspoken resentments. Dorothy sat in the passenger seat of Sophia's BMW, her weathered hands folded carefully in her lap, occasionally glancing at her granddaughter as if she were seeing her clearly for the first time in years. As they pulled into Shady Acres Mobile Home Park, Dorothy noticed several cars parked outside her trailer, including Linda's Honda and an unfamiliar pickup truck. Mrs. Patterson was standing on her small porch, wringing her hands and looking toward Dorothy's home with an expression of barely contained distress. "Something's wrong," Dorothy said, her grandmother's intuition immediately alert to the energy surrounding her home. Sophia parked quickly, and they both hurried to the trailer where they found Linda sitting at the kitchen table with a man in his 50s wearing a rumpled suit. The man's badge identified him as Detective Rodriguez from the Kern County Sheriff's Department. Linda's face was tear-streaked, and she looked up at her mother and daughter with relief mixed with profound sadness. "Mom, thank God you're here," Linda said, rising to embrace Dorothy. "This is Detective Rodriguez. He's been trying to reach you for 2 days." The detective stood respectfully, removing his hat. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but we need to talk about your nephew, Miguel Sandoval." Dorothy's face went pale. Miguel was Carmen's son, the boy she had helped raise after his mother died of cancer. He had struggled with addiction for years, drifting between rehab programs and halfway houses, but Dorothy had never given up on him. She had sent him money when she could barely afford it, had taken his late-night phone calls when he was desperate, had visited him in jail more times than she could count. "Is he—" Dorothy couldn't finish the question. "He's alive, Mom, but he's in critical condition at Kern Medical Center. There was an accident, a hit and run on Highway 99 2 nights ago. He's been asking for you. The doctors, they don't think he has much time." Dorothy sank into her chair, the weight of this new tragedy threatening to crush her already fragile emotional state. Sophia immediately knelt beside her grandmother, taking her hands in a gesture that would have been natural just weeks ago, but now felt like a tentative bridge across the chasm their relationship had become. "We need to go to the hospital right now," Sophia said, looking between her mother and grandmother. "I'll drive." At Kern Medical Center, they found Miguel in the ICU, barely recognizable beneath the tubes and monitors that were keeping him alive. His face was swollen and bruised, his left leg was in traction, and the steady beeping of machines provided a rhythmic soundtrack to what everyone knew would likely be their final conversation with him. Dorothy approached his bedside with the careful steps of someone who had said goodbye to too many loved ones. Miguel's eyes fluttered open when he heard her voice, and despite the pain medication, he managed a weak smile. "Tia Dorothy," he whispered, using the affectionate term he'd called her since childhood. "I knew you'd come." "I'm here, mijo," Dorothy said, gently stroking his forehead. "I'm not going anywhere." Miguel's gaze shifted to Sophia, standing nervously at the foot of the bed. "Sophia? Is that really you? You look different." "I'm here too, Miguel," Sophia said, surprised by how much emotion she felt seeing her cousin in this condition. They hadn't been close in recent years. His addiction had created distances that her rising social status had made even wider. "Tia," Miguel said, his voice growing weaker, "I need to tell you something. About the money you sent me last month for rent. I didn't use it for drugs, I promise. I used it to buy groceries for Mrs. Hernandez next door. She's 93 and her grandson never visits. I wanted you to know that your money went to something good." Dorothy's tears fell freely now, not just for the tragedy of Miguel's condition, but for the glimpse of the good man he had always been beneath his struggles. Even in his darkest moments, he had found ways to help others, just as she had taught him when he was a boy grieving his mother's death. Over the next 6 hours, the family took turns sitting with Miguel, sharing memories and offering comfort. Linda told stories about his childhood, about the summer he had learned to ride a bike in the trailer park, about the Christmas when he had saved his allowance to buy Dorothy a small potted plant because he knew how much she loved her garden. Sophia found herself remembering things she had forgotten. Miguel teaching her to catch fireflies during hot Bakersfield summers, the way he had defended her from neighborhood bullies when she was small. His dreams of becoming a mechanic before addiction derailed his life. As dawn approached, Miguel's breathing became more labored. The family gathered around his bed, holding hands in a circle that included Dorothy, Linda, Sophia, and several cousins who had driven through the night to say goodbye. In his final moments, Miguel looked at Dorothy with clear eyes and said, "Thank you for never giving up on me, Tia. Thank you for showing me what love looks like." He died as the sun rose over the Central Valley, with his family surrounding him in the kind of unconditional love that Dorothy had spent her entire life giving freely, even when it wasn't deserved, even when it wasn't appreciated, even when it was taken for granted. In the grief that followed Miguel's death, something profound shifted in Sophia's understanding of what family truly meant. She saw how her grandmother's love extended beyond blood relations, how Dorothy had claimed Miguel as her own when he needed a mother, how she had continued to believe in his goodness even when everyone else had given up. Standing in that hospital room, watching her grandmother grieve for another lost soul she had tried to save, Sophia finally understood the depth of the love she had rejected and the magnitude of her own selfishness. Miguel's funeral was held at the same small church in Fresno, where Sophia had found Dorothy just days earlier. The service was simple but profound, attended by an unexpected mix of people: relatives from across California, former co-workers from the various jobs Miguel had held during his sober periods, and several residents from the halfway house where he had been living before the accident. As Sophia listened to the stories people shared about her cousin, she began to see a pattern that extended far beyond Miguel's individual struggles. Person after person spoke about Dorothy's influence in Miguel's life, about the woman who had visited him in rehab centers, who had picked him up from jail without judgment, who had continued to believe in his capacity for redemption even when he had stopped believing in himself. "Your grandmother saved my life," said Maria Vasquez, a middle-aged woman who had met Miguel in a recovery program. "When I was living on the streets, Miguel brought me to Dorothy's trailer. She made me lunch, gave me clean clothes, and helped me find a job. She never asked questions about my past. She just saw someone who needed help and provided it." And after the service, as the family gathered at Dorothy's trailer for a traditional meal, Sophia noticed something she had never paid attention to before. The walls were covered not just with family photos, but with cards and letters from people whose lives Dorothy had touched over the years. Former co-workers who had needed emergency loans, neighbors who had received help during difficult times, students from the local community college where Dorothy had quietly volunteered for literacy programs despite having only a high school education herself. "Abuela," Sophia said, pulling her grandmother aside, "I never knew about all these people you've helped." Dorothy looked embarrassed by the attention. "It's nothing special, mija. When you don't have much money to give, you give what you can: time, food, a listening ear. These people would have done the same for me." But Sophia was beginning to understand that this wasn't true. Dorothy's generosity wasn't common or expected, it was extraordinary. Her grandmother had created a network of love and support that extended throughout their community, touching lives in ways that Sophia's wealthy new social circle never would. That evening, as the last guest departed and Linda headed home to prepare for her shift at the hospital, Sophia found herself alone with Dorothy for the first time since their confrontation at the church. They sat together on the small couch, the same one where Sophia had spent countless childhood evenings listening to her grandmother's stories. "I've been thinking about what you said in the church," Dorothy said quietly, "about being proud of where you came from. But I worry, mija, that I might hold you back from the life you've built with Jonathan." Sophia turned to face her grandmother fully. "Abuela, I need to tell you something about that life I built, about the person I became when I was trying so hard to fit in with Jonathan's world." Over the next hour, Sophia confessed everything: how she had lied about her background at work, claiming her family owned a successful business in Bakersfield, rather than admitting her grandmother lived in a trailer park. How she had avoided bringing Jonathan to meet her family for over a year, always making excuses about why it wasn't convenient. How she had gradually stopped calling Dorothy as frequently, allowing weeks to pass between conversations because she was afraid her co-workers might overhear her speaking Spanish or discussing her grandmother's simple life. "I became someone I don't even recognize," Sophia said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought success meant erasing my past, but all I really erased was the best part of myself, the part that came from you." Dorothy listened without judgment, occasionally reaching over to squeeze Sophia's hand. When her granddaughter finished speaking, Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, processing the depth of the rejection she had experienced. "You know," Dorothy finally said, "when I was your age, I was ashamed of my own mother. She spoke broken English, couldn't read very well, worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families in Fresno. I remember feeling embarrassed when she came to my high school graduation, worried that my classmates would judge me for having a mother who cleaned other people's toilets for a living." Sophia looked up, surprised. She had never heard this story before. "It took me years to understand that my mother's work wasn't shameful, it was honorable. She fed our family and kept us together by doing honest work with dignity. But by the time I learned to appreciate her sacrifices, she was gone, and I never got the chance to tell her how proud I should have been to be her daughter. Dorothy stood up and walked to her small kitchen, returning with 2 cups of café de olla, the sweet cinnamon coffee that had been a comfort ritual between them for decades. "I don't want you to repeat my mistake, mija," Dorothy said, handing Sophia the warm cup. "But I also don't want to be the reason you can't build the life you want. If being my granddaughter makes your new life harder, then maybe—" "No," Sophia interrupted firmly. "Being your granddaughter is the greatest privilege of my life, and if the people in my new world can't see that, then they don't deserve to be part of my story." As they sat together in the quiet trailer, sharing coffee and memories under the gentle glow of Dorothy's reading lamp, Sophia made a decision that would reshape her entire future. She would no longer hide her heritage or minimize her family's struggles. She would speak openly about her grandmother's sacrifices, about the trailer park that had been her second home, about the love that had made her education and success possible. More than that, she would find ways to continue Dorothy's legacy of quiet generosity, using her new resources and connections to help others the way her grandmother had helped Miguel, Maria, and countless others throughout her life. The simple trailer in Shady Acres Mobile Home Park had produced more real wealth than all the mansions in Malibu. It had created a legacy of unconditional love that would continue long after the physical structures had crumbled away. As we close this chapter, take a moment to reflect. What would you have done in Dorothy's shoes? Would you have let the wounds of rejection shape your choices? Or would you have found a way to forgive, to heal, and to embrace the love that still existed despite the pain? Dorothy's story is one of sacrifice, strength, and ultimately, redemption. But it also reminds us of the importance of understanding, of seeing beyond appearances, and recognizing the silent sacrifices made by those who love us the most. Sometimes we fail to appreciate the quiet acts of love that surround us. How often do we dismiss the ones who gave everything simply because their lives don't fit the image we expect? What if we looked a little deeper, listened a little longer, and recognize the quiet strength in those who are often overlooked? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel for more emotionally powerful tales. Like this video to show your support, and share it with others who need to hear these kinds of stories. Let's continue to celebrate the power of love, sacrifice, and the hidden stories of the people around us. Tell us where you're watching from and join the conversation.